website. So we have like 3 amazing experts on this topic, and I'm very excited to hear more about it. And as I said before, we will start with Monika, who will give an overall introduction to the situation and also gives us an insight into her work. Can you share your screen, or you need an...
Yeah, thank you, Nadine, and hello to everyone who's listening today. Hola to Andrés y María. Very nice to meet you here. And now I will share my presentation with you. Hope that works. Can you see my screen? I will try to be short, but it's really a challenge to be short. Speaking about the Colombian armed conflict, Maria and Andres know that it's really difficult, but you have to know some things to understand what's going on. So I will speak about the root causes, the peace negotiations, work and results of the Commission for Truth, Coexistence and Non-Repetition. That is important to understand the dimension of the conflict we are speaking about. The armed conflict today, some conclusions, and then the role of the Catholic Church and my task as an advisor for peace and conflict work at the Catholic Bishops' Conference in Colombia. The root causes. The armed conflict in Colombia is deeply rooted to historical, social, economic, and political factors. Some of the key causes include inequality and land disputes. Colombia has long suffered from extreme economic inequality, particularly in the rural areas, and is still today one of the countries with the highest level of inequality in the world. There's only South Africa and Namibia with more inequality than Colombia. Unequal land distributions has fueled tensions with owners of large land parcels controlling the majority of territories, while poor farmers struggle to survive. Inspired by Marxist ideologies, the theology of liberation and the Cuban Revolution, leftist guerrilla groups like the FARC, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, ELN, Liberation Army, and a movement M19. By the way, our president was a former guerrillero from M19, emerged to fight against state oppression and land inequality. Throughout Colombia's history, the opportunities for this social inequality to be addressed through the political system have been blocked by systemic political violence, and it's still going on. Opposition parties, progressive political movements, and community activists have been targeted in order to protect the political and economic status quo. The armed conflict was therefore a direct result of an unanswered social and political conflict. Another root cause is the political exclusion and weak state presence. Historically, Colombia's political system excluded large portions of the population, particularly rural Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities. They call it here structural racism, and I would call it systemic racism. The state failed to provide basic services, security, and governance in rural areas, created a power vacuum filled by guerrilla and paramilitary groups. Armed groups like the FARC and ELN initially sought to represent marginalized populations through revolutionary ideologies. Right-wing paramilitary groups were formed to counter guerrillas, often with a strong support from landowners, business leaders, and sectors of the state and the military targeting political activists. The expansion of drug cartels, you remember for sure Medellin and Pablo Escobar and the Cali cartel, fueled violence and corruption. And under Plan Colombia, that was US-backed military aid, the government intensified military operation against guerrillas calling it counterinsurgency. Peace negotiations. Every government in Colombia since the 1980s had peace negotiations with armed groups. We can highlight the demobilization of paramilitary. In 2006, it was the Álvaro Uribe administration. And of course, in 2016, the peace agreement with the FARC. It's called a historic peace accord, including a special ethnic chapter, was signed under President Juan Manuel Santos, who received Peace Nobel Prize for that, leading to the demobilization of most FARC fighters. However, some dissidents rejected the peace process and continue armed activities till today, the Estado Mayor Central, EMC. There are more groups, but this is the one who from the beginning rejected the peace process. In the present days, we can see an armed group fragmentation. Several groups of FARC dissidents and dissidents of the dissidents, ELN, and criminal groups like the Gulf Clan or Autodefensa Gaitanista de Colombia continue violent operations. The total peace policy under the first and nowadays president, the first left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, aims to negotiate with all armed groups, but a lot of challenges remain. And despite peace efforts, violence persists due to ongoing fragmentation of armed groups, drug trafficking, other illegal economies, and state weaknesses. The Commission for Truth, Coexistence, and Non-Repetition was established as a result of the 2016 peace accord, as well as the Special Justice for Peace and the Unit for Search of Missing People. And this Truth Commission undertook an unprecedented task in Colombia, working from 2018 until 2022, and listening to nearly 30,000 individuals, not only in Colombia, but all over the world where they are distributed, seeking to understand and explain the facts and motivations behind the war. The Truth Commission states horrendous war crimes and crimes against humanity, which were carried out in the armed conflict with over 9 million victims. And the president of the Truth Commission said, if you see that every one of the victims has a family, and we calculate that there are three family members, then you have 27 million victims and a population of 52 million Colombians. It's half of the country victim of this armed conflict. The Commission highlights that the main victims, almost 80%, were the civilian population, wherein farmers and ethnic populations, indigenous, Afro-Colombian, Rizal, and Palenquero people suffered disproportionately in the conflict. Approximately 450,000 deaths occurred between 1985 and 2018, and half of these deaths were made by the paramilitary groups. And two homicide modalities the Commission considered deserve special attention. There were more than 4,237 massacres between 1985 and 2021, with half of these committed by paramilitary groups, and the extrajudicial execution known as false positives committed entirely by state agents, often in alliance with paramilitary organizations, and estimated by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace at 6,402 for the period 2002 to 2008, the Álvaro Uribe administration, but estimated at over 8,000 for the entire period from 1958 to 2016. forced disappearance, over 110,000 people. If you compare it to Argentina, there were 30,000. Kidnapping, at least 50,000 people were victims of kidnapping, often in subhuman conditions for long periods and with devastating consequences on the physical and mental health of the victims and their families. The most famous case maybe is the case of Ingrid Betancourt, who was a former presidential candidate, now lives in France. Forced displacement, at least 8 million people were forced to off their land since 1985, with the highest peak in 2002, with a daily average of 2,000 displaced persons. Colombia with Syria are the countries with most internal displaced persons worldwide. Recruitment of children and young people for war, over 30,000. Sexual violence converted women's bodies into spoils of war. This modality of violence particularly affected Afro and indigenous women, but also men and the LGBTIQ+ population. If you look at the armed conflict today, you can see here the red regions. There are territorial disputes between armed groups. The yellow, dominance of one group, and the green is coexistence of several armed groups who made agreement between them. And the reports indicate that over 70% of Colombia's territory is under the influence of illegal armed groups, aggravating the humanitarian situations. So you see only 30% of the territory is under the influence of the government. The number of armed factions in the country surged from 141 in 2022 to 184 in 2024. And more than 120,000 people were victims of mass or individual forced displacement in 2024. And over 130,000 people were prevented from leaving their communities in 2024, a situation we know here as confinement, and 66% of these were indigenous communities. And the fears of anti-personnel landmines, threats by armed groups, and the hazards of crossfire persist for these communities almost everywhere in the country. We have several current humanitarian crises, primarily driven by the ongoing armed conflict, we have to say, displacement and socioeconomic challenges. The humanitarian country team estimates that 9.1 million people require multisectoral assistance nationwide. And it needs a comprehensive and coordinated response or strategies to alleviate the suffering of millions. And that is a problem the government in Colombia has to coordinate all the tasks they have. It's really incredible what they have to do. Conclusion. The ongoing fragmentation and expansion of armed groups in Colombia has created a complex and volatile security environment, perpetuating cycles of violence and instability. The proliferation of splinter factions, each with distinct agendas and leadership, complicates negotiations efforts and undermines ceasefire agreements. The illegal activities like human and drug trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, and other activities further complicate the security landscape and provide revenue to armed groups. Regions rich in gold, emeralds, and other resources are heavily contested by criminal organizations, and that lack of state regulation allows criminal economies to flourish. In summary, Colombia's current political situation is characterized by internal government conflicts, ongoing security challenges, and a perceived decline in democratic robustness. These factors collectively contribute to a complex and evolving political environment. Achieving lasting peace will require sustained efforts, including addressing the root causes of the conflict, a very important thing, ensuring the protection of human rights and fostering inclusive development in affected regions. Well, the role of the Colombian Catholic Church in peace and conflict work is my work. The Catholic Church has played a significant role in Colombia's peace processes, serving as a mediator, moral authority, and advocate for a holistic peace approach and reconciliation. Today, it continues to be a key player in Colombia's ongoing peace efforts, promoting dialogue, supporting victims, and advocating for justice and reconciliation. Its influence extends beyond politics, shaping societal attitudes towards peace and coexistence in a deeply Catholic country. And my task is to support the Catholic Church in the areas to follow with my knowledge, my professional and personal experience, and practical help. That means that I have to work with bishops, the clergy, armed actors, and on community level. Here you can see the levels of confidence. The president has a level of high confidence of 7.1. The Senate and House of Representatives 2.3. The police 10.6. Military 19.5, and the Catholic Church 34.8% of high level confidence. There is no other actor who has a higher level of confidence. Of course, there are criticism, mostly because of the allegations of past complicity, because the Catholic Church in colonial Colombia was both a spiritual and a political institution, deeply tied to Spanish rule. It played a complex role, spreading Christianity, shaping culture, and providing education, but also supporting colonial hierarchies, forced labor, and the suppression of indigenous and African traditions. And after independence, the Church historical alliance with the conservative elite fueled early conflicts. The challenges today, the threat against clergy, many priests and bishops have been targeted for their peace efforts, and some of them were kidnapped and murdered. And the resistance from hardline sectors, some sectors, including conservative politicians and ex-military figures, opposed the Church's advocacy for peace with former rebels and the efforts of peace with nature. That is, has to do with the economic model of extractivism. What does the Church do? Mediation and dialogue facilitation. The Church has acted as a mediator between the Colombian government and various armed groups, including the FARC and the ELN. The clergy members and bishops have participated in back-channel negotiations to build trust between the parties. The Church has promoted local peace dialogues in conflict-affected regions, creating spaces for victims, former combatants, and authority to engage in conversation. The victims of kidnapping generally are either handed over to the Catholic Church directly or in the presence of a priest or bishop. The advocacy for human rights and reconciliation, the Church has consistently denounced human rights violations by all sides, including guerrilla groups, paramilitaries, and state forces. It has supported the rights of indigenous communities, small farmers, and Afro-Colombians who have been disproportionately affected by violence. Catholic leaders have called for truth, justice, and reparations for victims while advocating for forgiveness and reconciliation. So the president of the Truth Commission was a Jesuit priest and a really very recognized voice in human rights in Colombia. The support for victims and reintegration, the Church has played a central role in supporting victims of war, offering psychological, spiritual, and material aid. It has worked with former guerrillas and paramilitaries on reintegration programs, helping them transition into civilian life through vocational training, counseling, and community engagement. And many church-run organizations like Caritas Colombia provide humanitarian assistance to displaced populations. Promoting the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement. Following these peace accords, the church has actively promoted its implementation despite challenges. And there's a lot to do still. Catholic leaders have urged the government to fulfill its commitments, especially regarding rural development and security guarantees. The church has helped counter polarization and misinformation about the peace process by fostering dialogue and education. The engagement with the armed groups and ongoing conflict. The church has continued efforts to facilitate peace talks with the armed groups, advocating for humanitarian agreements and ceasefires. It has urged armed groups to respect international humanitarian law and to reduce violence against civilians. The church monitors the ceasefires and agreements between Colombian government and armed groups together with the UN and OAS, because it's the only institution with presence all over the country. And I heard UN and OAS members say, without the church, we are unable to do this work, this monitoring. The role of Colombian Catholic Church is not only in the work in the communities and with the armed groups, but it's a moral and ethical leadership, because it's, as I said before, a deeply Catholic country, emphasizing the importance of peace, forgiveness, and justice. Pope Francis visited Colombia in 2017, reinforced the message of reconciliation, urging Colombians to embrace a future of peace. And peace work is seen as a holistic approach which includes peace with nature. And this is based in the encyclical Laudato Si of Pope Francis. So as you can see, the work I'm supporting is a very strong work, and it's a very important work in a country like Colombia. And I hope I could give you an overview of what is going on here in Colombia.
Monika, thank you so much for this insight. I think I learned a lot. I was not aware that the Catholic Church has such high trust ratings overall. I think it's very important to share these perspectives because it probably differs very much like globally when we look at it. If it's okay with all of you, I would prefer if each one of you, like the other two presenters, give their 15-minute like input, and then we have an overall discussions where also, of course, we can direct specific questions to each speaker. For example, Monika, I have actually already a list of questions I would like to ask you, but I think maybe to be able to also incorporate what the others say, it might be good maybe to finish the input and then have the discussion. So Maria, if you're okay, then it's your turn, and maybe to give a disclaimer to all of you that we shortened probably the presentation a bit. And we're very grateful that Maria can be here because as me, you heard me coughing, like we all are a bit sick. So we tried still to make this event possible today so we can learn about Colombia. So the Zoom stage is yours. And maybe 1 second, if like if it's like 2 minutes to the 15 minutes are over, I will raise my hand so you can see like as a sign. Yeah.
Yeah, the problem is, hi everyone. The problem is that I don't see you anymore. Maybe you can just, let me quickly check if I can see you again somehow.
I raise my hand. Does it pop up or no?
No, the problem is that, give me a second. I don't know. It's so,
okay, so maybe I will just send you a note on your phone if you have your phone next to you or something like that. but I don't want to interrupt while you are speaking. So we just see, we still have time. Okay.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I will just try to, okay, so first of all, thank you everyone, and sorry for my voice. I hope to make it through the presentation. I have prepared a bigger presentation than I would normally do because I thought it can help you listen to me, basically. So it builds on my doctoral research, and the concern of my thesis was to look at ethnicized activism and state-led peace building in Colombia and the potential that it has. So Monika has already said that an ethnic chapter was included in the 2016 peace agreement in Colombia, and that chapter was written by the activists whom you see on the picture, some of them. And so it was a huge success of the ethnic struggle, as you could call it, and it positioned them as a third actor in the peace agreement, a non-conflict actor, which is also important to emphasize. The indigenous Afro-Colombian activists came together for this because they have been, as Monika also mentioned already, highly affected by the armed conflict, and this becomes visible only in that 71 out of the 115 indigenous nations are at imminent risk of extermination due to the armed conflict. And Afro-Colombians are those who are most forcibly displaced. So also Rizal, home, the island of San Andres and Providence. San Andres is at the brink of ecological collapse because of the economies which are related to the armed conflict. So all in all, ethnicized population is much more affected by the armed conflict than the white mestizo population is. So on the one hand, ethnicized activists or ethnicized populations and their organizations were totally in the need or in the imminent necessity of peace, but at the same time they were worried about that this peace would be at the cost of their pervivencia, so their possibility to remain themselves. So what I want to discuss and what was part of my research as well was like, what can we learn from this activism on violence, conflict, peace, and on peace building? And yeah, I will introduce a little bit the concept of pluriversal peace, and we can maybe discuss that as an alternative to hegemonic peace building too. So all in all, I did 12 months of research between 2017 and 2019. And then again in 2024, and I accompanied 22 indigenous Afro-Colombian Palenquero, Black, Rizal, and Rome top-level peace activists. And as you can see from the picture, they come from different regions. Monika has shown before the map of the conflict regions, so it overlaps with where they come from. And they're members of a variety of different ethnic organizations, but they came together and worked from their differences in order to have an input on the state peace building process. So often when we think of indigenous or Afro-Colombian peace activism, we think of we have a very romanticized idea of that activism at the grassroots level. But what I was looking at was their activism and how they intervene in peace building and transitional justice institutions, and also how they negotiate with the state. So these are some of the impressions of the moments which I accompanied. On the left side, you can see where they are, for example, ISO organization, the Indigenous Organization of the Southwest of Colombia is in conversation with the unit of missing peoples here, with missing persons. And as you can see, they're holding the names of their beloved ones who are missing. Then the second one is a meeting where they were invited to an informal lunch with the Truth Commission and tried to get their idea of what truth means and signifies for them heard. The third one is a picture of where they were in negotiations with the state. So on the left side, you see indigenous Afro-Colombian and Rome and Gitano and Palenquero and Rizal activists on the one hand, and on the right side, you see the government then under Santos, when they were negotiating how to track the implementation of the ethnic chapter. And on the right side, you can see a picture of the prior consultation process where the Yanacuna magistrate Hormiga Sanchez who's the magistrate of the special peace jurisdiction, and he had a meeting, a prior consultation process with Krieg organization. So Krieg is the biggest and most important, most powerful, maybe, indigenous organization in the country. Yeah, so before I talk about the results, because also Nadine asked us to think a little bit how scientific methods can be adapted to better reflect the reality or situation of marginalized communities. I just wanted to quickly present the methodological principles with which I worked, because me being a German Colombian white urban raised researcher, so it was important to think about where my own limits of understanding, the limits of my horizon are, and how I can track these limits and maybe even scratch at them and overcome them. And one key element was sentir, pensar y caminar juntos. So one is walking together, accompanying activists in their routines, in their work. During these 12 months, during 2 years, but also to be very attentive to my own feelings and my own horizon, and to make it through the incommensurable abilities when you do research. So often we find ourselves in a situation where we think, I don't share this opinion, and just to accept this for a bit, and then give yourself the chance through a spiral understanding of your own learning path, to say it like that, to re-understand the situation in you, and also to be open to the understanding and reflections of the activists themselves. So here is an example of Albeniz Tique from ISO doing a harmonization process ritual for the doctoral thesis itself. So that is in 2024, when I went back and I presented the preliminary results of my thesis to them. So, and there they gave me feedback and gave me their own interpretation of my work. And that allowed me again to rethink through my work and to analyze certain assessments or certain conclusions that I had made as well. So how does this increase our understanding towards violence, conflict, peace, and peace building? So I will present 4 points. The first one is that we need to acknowledge Colombia as a pluriversal territory in Bogota and beyond. So my research was in Bogota, in the capital of Colombia, and I was working, as I told you, with whom I call top-level ethnicized peace activists. But very often, when we think of ethnicity, we discuss it as something that is the periphery, and that it's only relevant if we go to the periphery. And one of the first, I think, main points of my research is that we need to acknowledge that Colombia is a pluriversal territory. So that means that a variety of ways of perceiving and relating to the world are not limited to the periphery, but they are everywhere, and they overlap. And we need to create a country where what we call ethnicity has a right to be in their own right, also in the capital. And and this is a picture. The left one is a picture of the process of Afro-Colombian communities, of Black communities in the capital, demonstrating the assassination of social activists. And on the right side, that is from a demonstration of Rizal activists in San Andres, where they say that all the territory of the archipelago is ethnic territory. That's a very important point, because their island has become a mass tourist place where they have very little autonomy over it. So the main point here is that we must recognize the peripheralization of what we understand as ethnic as political as well. So therefore, authors from political ontology talk about that how we perceive worlds, how we perceive the world is already a political act because it is a result of practices and reproduces also our political actions. And therefore, we must include ethnicized voices, visions, and expertise on equal footing in peace building too. And if we do that, or why we should do that, I also discussed one of the main results is what I call, or what I describe as rooted epistemic resistance. So it's composed of 5 elements. Some of you may know standpoint epistemologies, from feminist research, right? From Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, and so on. So the knowledge that you have because you're affected in a certain way by violence, and these activists have been affected by different forms of violence that make them an expert and give them an epistemic privilege on this, on understanding violence. But there are also other elements of this rooted epistemic resistance, and I can maybe just go through it a little bit more in the discussion. It is important because it helps us understand that when we look at the armed conflict, it is not, in my opinion, not very helpful to understand what we need for peace, because the armed conflict is very much often reduced to a very short amount of time. But if we look at violence, and particularly at violence against ethnicized populations in the territories through a long memory, then we see that there is a multidimensional violence against these populations, which is entangled with the armed conflict, but it precedes the armed conflict. And in that story of the multidimensional violence, for example, the Catholic Church plays a role, right, in conducting assimilationist violence against these populations too. And all these, and also the armed actors, and that is something that the Truth Commission has been able to show. They have reproduced as well heterosexism against matriarchal indigenous communities, for example. So they have conducted forms of violence to destroy ethnicized ways of being, which have nothing really to do with the armed conflict. So we can only understand that if we understand that this violence is to destroy their ways of life and to destroy their ways of resisting to coloniality as well. And so as a result, one of my points would be that in order to understand what we need for peace, we must first rethink what we understand by violence, and we must broaden our canon, our understanding and conceptualization of violence. And within that violence, armed conflict violence is one element, but it's not the other way around, to say it like that. And third point is what I discuss in my thesis as articulation. So I looked at, I started as well this research, and then it evolved a little bit and so on. But I started with this interest in interethnic cooperation. So we need to understand when they came together for this ethnic chapter, and also later how they institutionalized their work through the high level what's the space for ethnic instancia especial de pueblos étnicos.
Special instance for ethnic population.
Peoples, yeah. Thank you so much. So this is a special an element that is a result of the ethnic chapter, which was institutionalized, so that ethnicized populations could be, or the activists, whom you also see here in the picture, can see, monitor, and advise the implementation of the ethnic chapter. So it's a very important, per paper, it's a very important element of the ethnic chapter, but also of ethnicized participation. So they come together, but it's important to understand that this cooperation doesn't happen in a void, but they have been shaped. So interethnic cooperation has been shaped by cooperation history in the territories, but also by colonialism, coloniality, and conflict. So, and the state has had a crucial role in creating intergroup competition, intergroup competition between these communities, particularly between indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, because of the hierarchizing of these communities. So, for example, one would say that indigenous in Colombia are the preferred minority, and everyone has an indigenous grandma, to say like that, but no one has ever had of white people, right? Afro-Colombian ancestors. And even though Afro-Colombians are more in terms of quantity, they have less access to rights. And also this is also represented in the access to territory. So they have right now, I think, 6 million hectares, and indigenous have 34, I think, if I'm correct right now. So this has created intergroup competition and mistrust. And so that has been a historical challenge for them to come together under these situations. And also when I was there in this instancia ampliada, what I witnessed was that the state was always trying to play them out against each other in these negotiations. And however, they used what I then call in line also in dialogue with Darío Mejía, an activist, a new activist from ONIC, is articulación, so that they come together without dissolving their differences of what it means for them to be indigenous, or what it means to be Afro-Colombian, or what it means to be Zenu, what it means to be Pijao, and at the same time work around how colonialism and conflict has created rifts between them, and to be attentive to this and remain in a fragile unity in difference, to say it like that. But I think, and that is my point, it's very valuable to look at this process to understand how we can create or work towards peace from difference, and also from being in a state of coloniality that affects us differently. Yeah, and fourth, I've already touched upon it, but we do need to talk about the bottlenecks as well. So peace-building institutions can also be understood as sites of struggle over decoloniality. So I think it's important to, on the one hand, to have this, to be attentive to this ambivalence. So for example, for this, with what I started in the beginning, that we see that ethnicized activists were very clear that they would support peace building and the peace agreement, and it was necessary and desired. At the same time, there is a fear that their interests will be sacrificed for the greater good. And this is something which I heard as well from state representatives in that meeting, but which is also historical, which is also historical, for example, in the 1999 Constitution, where Afro-Colombians were fighting for them being recognized as an ethnic group. They were also being asked not to request the same rights as indigenous, because it wouldn't be good for the country. So we see this kind of responsibility of the state on the one hand, but also we see it also in peace building institutions itself. So for example, in the Truth Commission, when we talk about what is truth, and here it was, here's the quote from Darío Mejía, that where he urges institutions to be born with the seed of the non-repetition of exclusion and what it means. But at the same time, during these processes, there were multiple instances where, which I also observed, but which also is part of the conversations with activists, where they were not taken seriously or in the same, on the same level, or for example, their over memory was not acknowledged to the same extent as archives would be, for example, for the case of the Truth Commission. And so as a result, we need to proactively address and defy coloniality. So for example, also when we ask like who is knowledgeable in a peace building process, and where this knowledge comes from, and if we limit it to the university, or if we understand that there is a specific expertise that is beyond what a university can also achieve and know. So in the end, as a best practice, and I think Monika has also mentioned that, is the ethnic chapter of the final report, which I really recommend you to read it, because there they really overcome lots of the limitations of Eurocentrism to understand violence. And they talk about, for example, the role that sexual and gender-based violence has played to destroy these communities and their territories. So, for example, how this violence was used to destroy matriarchy, but also to destroy non-heterosexist communities, so directing against what we would describe as LGBTIQ, the violence from all of the armed actors. So yeah, that's it so far, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. It was right on time. I think I had 5 seconds left before I would have known if So
Message.
So yeah, I didn't send it yet. So thank you so much. I think it was super interesting on like a content level, but also conceptual level, as I told you, to reflect also on like research methods, because usually in psychology, especially mainstream psychology, we have a very unilateral view of how we conduct research. It's usually lab-based, quantitative, and especially when we want to go into peace processes, and I think especially the impact of peace psychology and also how psychological processes play a role in peace and conflict settings is growing. So more and more psychologists get included into consulting and also in advising like situations. We need to also reflect on where we draw our knowledge from and where it comes from and how it might like impact our recommendations and how well it might be suitable for the context actually we're gonna base it in. So also I have a lot of questions for you, but also we maybe gonna put the spotlight on Andrés for now, so he give us more insights on it, also from a lot of different directions, and I'm very excited to hear from you, and then after we can exchange in a discussion.
Perfect. Let me, okay, it's open. Thank you so much. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We can see the slide and we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm based in Bogota right now. So good evening to everyone who are in another time zone, or good morning, hopefully, for other people. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Nadine, for organizing this panel on Colombia. And I thank you all for your interest in my country, in not only in the great research activities and applied research activities that we are seeing through great colleagues, but also the importance of the people who are building peace, like not only the Catholic Church, but also a lot of social leaders that have been, as it happens with Catholic priests and nuns, have been, endangered, killed, also tortured. So it's a reality, and I love that we are bringing in their stories and the role in peace that is very silent many times, sorry. So it's important also to portray the role of communities in these and communitary-based organizations in these peace building challenges that we face currently. So we had an excellent summary of the story, the history, the story, and also the key stages of the Colombian conflict. And now we have seen not only the role of, religious institutions, but also on ethnic organizations that have been key and central to decentralize, decolonize, and also change the way that we approach conflict in Colombia. As you have concluded till now, it's a very complex situation. So it's not easy to tell the story, but also to analyze how we can use social science and social research from a scientific point of view in a broad manner to the territories, and also to build this dialogue between the protagonists of the situation and also the researchers and decision makers that want to collaborate and come in to make a peace less disastrous than war, right? So basically what I want to do with my time is share with you how we are applying brain and behavioral science to peace building in Colombia. Basically, doing as my colleagues have done, trying to give a small response to each of the questions that Nadine kindly shared with us, and basically go into them and try to tell you more about what we do in Colombia, to learn, to understand, to explain, and then to try to mobilize in terms of trying to attain social change in an incremental manner. So first, when we think about what are the key barriers and opportunities for sustainable peace and development in Colombia, I would say that this image can tell us not only in Colombia, but in the rest of the world. Now, I always say that globalization also made us lose the monopoly of bad ideas, because we normally, as Colombians, have been pointed out as terrible people who have all this stigma on because of the stories of narco trafficking and all these things that the Americans especially have, in a sense, celebrated through their media and through their entertainment. But we are so much more, right? But one thing that, in a sense, has been interesting after COVID is the importance that the whole world has been sharing the same problems, especially the ones related to intergroup hostility, obviously not in the same severe way that we have faced it through more than, the whole history of Colombia has been, marked by internal armed conflict, but especially in modern times, we can say we have, basically have had violence as part of our political dynamics and our systemic relationships. So in that sense, the I would say the easy response to such a complex question is what we see on this image, is what Rita Mae Brown, who was a great American feminist writer, defined as madness, right? Insanity is doing the same things, expecting different outcomes. For many years, people said that Einstein said this, but we know strictly that was this American writer who proposed this idea. And I think it's very useful to understand this, especially not only for Colombia, but the whole world when we think about peace building. So in that sense, it's important also to understand that not only in Colombia, but worldwide, standard views about peace building in many ways do a poor contribution to think, especially complex settings, especially in a time like ours, where the traditional, or would say standard authorities, and I would say like hegemonic views of how social order can be built are diluting, are disappearing very fast. So we are on uncharted territories, and especially we can go back to John Elster's work, this Norwegian philosopher who thought about human behavior intensively, and especially on the role of connection between human institutions and what people really act and do, on how we can, in a sense, close the gap between these two views, right? Pass from the normative and move towards the empirical in terms of what people really do in context, and the role of legacy, the role of territorial stories, about ethnicities, culture, and all the other aspects that have made us understand that context matters. But more than context, it's important to understand that designing institutions or processes, especially to turn the page afterward, is difficult, not because of the complexity of violence in each context, but especially if we have wrong assumptions about humans, and especially the historical aspects, and then the context of humans. And that's why I would say the main problem with this is understanding that events don't really determine the independent variables, as many scientists would say, of what are models in order to explain and implement solutions to protracted, in the case of Colombia, legacies of violence, in a sense, challenge us in order to understand what can be done. So in that sense, we obviously without recognizing that we have several angles to see what we can do and how we can, in a sense, understand these processes, these complex processes. We also can, in a sense, try to bring in the idea that reality is kind of a, of an iceberg, because normally we go to the surface, but we need to dive in and dive very profound in the causes that were already mentioned by my colleagues, patterns of behavior over time, structural, and I would say what we call more artificial results of the interactions between people that we can call institutions or culture, and then these aspects of mental models or shared learning processes that can be obviously the source of the, I would say, the freezing of societies in terms of not being able to disrupt the cycles of violence. And violences in terms that we don't only in Colombia have faced one type, but several, I would say, nested phenomena related to violence as a way to treat each other and solve social problems. So in order to heal that society in terms of recovering from trauma, from intergenerational injustices, etc., is the problem of understanding how a model can, especially from the behavioral, brain and behavioral sciences, can be useful to come into discussion and dialogue with other views of society, structural views, more collective views that are very important also, and can, in a sense, come in to understand more systemically and holistically what can be done after so many decades of war. So I take Dani Bartal's, the Israeli psychologist, view on what the effect of violence and protracted conflicts can arise in society and population, and in that sense, his concept about mind freeze for me is like the main point of my research. Is the idea not only to understand the cognitive and social, emotional, but also cultural and historical, societal aspects that contribute to that cognitive path dependence that in a sense is the source of institutional and economic path dependence that normally sustains inequality and violence as a means to resolve issues in a society, to keep hegemonies, and also to keep certain balances of power. And that would be, in a sense, for me, the explanation. And if we don't tackle that aspect of that iceberg that it still floats in our cultural waters in Colombia, it's important also to understand how we can bring in neuropsychology, what we know about the brain, what we know about brain plasticity, but also how we can begin to understand how social psychological barriers are work in terms of dynamics and in this sense would be their mechanisms, and then how we can use what we know on psychology, political psychology, and collective actions, identity politics, etc., to make the most out of our assumptions. So the short question to that great question that Nadine shared with us is through collaboration, in order to make more viable and more practical and applicable the things that we learn from research in the lab or on the field or in theoretical approaches. We need collaboration, and that collaboration cannot come only from our ivory tower, right? So we have been developing this network that is inspired in the work of two great humans. One of them, a Colombian Lithuanian mayor that we had in Bogota, a university professor who revolutionized Colombian politics. His name is Antanas Mockus, and he was the mayor of Bogota 30 years ago. And he, in a sense, started what we call like an anti-political way of seeing citizen engagement in Colombia. And he, with his partners in government, first in the National University and then in the Bogota government, they started this idea and notion in a moment where Bogota was broken as a society, as a territory, etc. In a moment where we were just trying to start I would say our dealing with the past of the narco trafficking violence, Antanas Mockus came out as an artist, in a sense, as an artist of social change in Colombia, and inspired us to think that citizens in general have a better idea on how to resolve problems than their governments. And it's important to activate that local knowledge through citizen engagement, especially what he defined an harmonization between the three regulatory systems of behavior, that was morals, social norms, and legal institutions, in order to harmonize them and try to see how they can be negotiated in terms of local values through pro-social leadership. So Antanas Mockus had this great story. You can see him there with one of his performative, appearances. He was incredible, and there's so much written about him. And I had the pleasure to work with him for several years. And Antanas Mockus, for example, when he was sentenced to death by the FARC, when he was a mayor, he used this. He was, in a sense, he was influenced to use an anti-bullet vest, but he decided to carve a heart for his enemies and tell them that he was there waiting for them in case they didn't understand that Colombian citizens wanted peace. And then we have the story of Émile Bruneau, the neuroscientist that you can see in the bottom picture. I had the immense pleasure and honor to work with Émile for many years in the University of Pennsylvania and bring his neuroscientific approach about how to design interventions to make science work for peace. So basically, the answer to the second question would be the one in terms of how do community-driven initiatives in Colombia align or clash with evidence-based policy and academic research. For me, the main problem here is that we still are in an ivory tower, especially in Colombia, and that colleagues such as Laura and Monika do great work by trying to, in a sense, close the gap between territories, science, and decision makers, and organizations from the civil society that can bridge this gap and can bring these knowledges for a dialogue and action. And I think that's what we doing, or the things that we have been doing in Colombia. I just want to basically take your attention to 3 projects that we have done, combining, this idea that I'm going to talk about in a minute on transitional research, that for me is the way to join efforts between scientists, between leaders, decision makers, community leaders, and then the protagonists of situations. So if we go back to 2016, we know that in Colombia, we were like in the moment for what William Sargent calls the ripeness of a conflict. In order, the military forces were balanced, and the warriors decided to basically go to the negotiation table in La Habana. So it was a good moment. And we saw that the reaction of the public, instrumentally by certain interests, but also like naturally for people who had faced the effects and victimhood of FARC and other guerrillas. They didn't want peace through these means. They thought it was an unjust peace, but it was the legal peace that Colombia decided to take advantage of in terms of the Santos government, and we decided to move on. So in that time, I met Émile, and he told me why Colombians voted against peace. So we tried, basically, we ran a randomized control trial to understand, using implicit measures like the humanization, collective victimhood, meta-perceptions, empathy, and group identities that we normally don't measure in surveys. So we decided to bring in these new measures and do a lot of qualitative work, especially understanding what Colombians, real, live Colombians in the rural and urban areas gave us, through interviews, they shared their stories. So we find, combining these methods, we had like 3 aspects that, as you can see on the screen, they definitely made it difficult for peace to work. And not only was a communicational problem from the people such as myself and others who supported the yes vote, but it was more the effects of a situation that we cannot demand to change automatically in people's minds and hearts. So we found that especially the humanization was huge against FARC members. So we went back to Dabeiba, a population in Antioquia, and we had the chance and the, like the generosity of the FARC community there that was in the transitional camp where they were starting the reincorporation process. And we had the collaboration throughout 6 months where we basically dived in their culture, their stories, and the stories of their neighbors who were previously victimized by those fronts that were now demobilizing there. And we recorded 11 videos that we designed using what we knew at that point, what works in order to influence and reduce prejudice, especially on terms of dehumanization, in terms of divisions, and then a central aspect that we didn't know that worked and for now it's still replicating in the experiments that I keep doing, is the meta perceptions, the idea, these assumptions and biases that you have about the intentions of the other group that are difficult to dismount, especially or to change, especially if you were affected. But then we saw that the people who really resisted the peace process were people who were non-affected Colombians living in urban areas. So we needed to use a mechanism that would take people who were not motivated to participate in this type of meetings. So we decided to expose people through videos, right? Online videos that through an experiment we used. And we managed to randomize these videos and allocate these videos to the viewers and understand what video had the most impact. And we found out, and we published this in back in 2022 in Nature Human Behavior. We understood especially that in Colombia, empathy is not like a nice message, especially if we're talking about FARC members. We first need to present with them their story about the successes they have in terms of being capable of change, because dehumanization basically block your idea that other being is human, and then that it has neuroplasticity, so he or her can change, right? So we found that using a video that really, and a technique that uses affirmation for those human capacities, then the social proof from neighboring, communities, families, and also from the military, from teachers who are also, and people in the Catholic Church that appeared in videos telling us how FARC people are able to change. They basically helped us find these results. And these results were covered by a very nice series that was presented in the Discovery Channel, produced by Alex Gibney and Steven Spielberg, that I really recommend to see if you're interested. It's called Why We Hate. And if you're interested in the several approaches, especially from brain and behavioral science, we are the last chapter called Hope, that tells the story of Emile Bruno before he passed and the work we were doing here. So that was one example of bringing in scientists, communities, decision makers to build local peace and start replicating this in terms of using parasocial contact. And then we decided to test what happens in order, if we want to massify or make this like a real impact in terms of communities, we tried to test what happened with a documentary that was telling the story of two brothers whose mother was kidnapped by FARC for many years, but then she was let free. But for her, it was very dear, the story of the guy from FARC who kept her safe throughout her kidnapping. And this may sound crazy, and you will go immediately, this is, the Stockholm Syndrome or whatever, but it's a very nice story. This documentary is on, it's free, you can see it in, I will, Nadine, please remind me, and I will send the link to the documentary. But we wanted to test in a moment after COVID, how Colombians were feeling about the peace process, and do it indirectly, trying to evaluate how people who were not going to the cinema, they were going out to see, I don't know, Fast and Furious 24 or something like that. And we, in a sense, invited them and incentivized them to see the movie that they didn't want it to see, and to see the effects that it has on the field. So we are specializing in this type of field experiments, again, trying to see if this story had effects on dehumanization, it disturbs positively in rehumanization, changing negative meta-perceptions, and I forgot to say that our outcomes are always economic experiments with real money, so people can keep the money or allocate them in in this time around was for FARC initiatives or ex-combatants initiatives who were building masks for COVID or sold coffee or whatever. So people started allocating more. In the other experience, what we did is like we did all these same outcome measures, behavioral outcome measures using money, but then we ask people to send a message, or to, in this case, would be to hire a real life, a CV, a real life CV of obviously we changed the name and the ID of a guerrilla member who just recuperated and was looking for a job. And finally, just to close, I don't know how my time is going, but we did this other experiment that I really love. I'm really happy to have been a part of this with the mission, the UN mission in Colombia throughout the pandemic. We had a change of government after President Santos, who was the leader, the president who basically, led the peace building process and negotiated with FARC and started the peace process. Then we had another president that was a right-wing president who managed to destroy the peace process through basically being negligent to allocate resources, and the violence started to punish especially ex-combatants from FARC and social leaders. So what we did is, since in Colombia the authorities were not responsive, society was, obviously not focused on the peace process because everybody was so preoccupied and obviously stressed out by the pandemic. What we did is like we sent a cinematographer with the help of the UN mission to several of these peace territories, especially the the ETCRs in PEDET regions. Basically, that's the regions decided where the government decided to basically support the reincorporation and then start allocation of resources to get communities deciding with FARC members on shared, infrastructures, schools, money, etc., to make it work. So what we did is, since we knew that the Colombian government was opposing the peace process, we had to take advantage of the Security Council, but we know that the Security Council members didn't know Colombia, didn't know the process, and all what was going on in the territory. They just saw numbers on a sheet of a report. So we used again the principle of indirect contact or parasocial contact to get people through virtual reality to be exposed to what communities were doing, obviously using what we learned from previous experiments to design the narrative, but not artificially, using the real stories of people and editing in ways that will persuade the Security Council members. And we were successful at that. We couldn't measure that, obviously, because of privacy reasons and all these prohibitions that it was very difficult experiment to do. But then we needed to prove what worked and what didn't at least to replicate this in Colombian universities. We decided to go for Colombian universities because for 2022 to 2023, kids in those universities were now, when the peace process was signed, they were like, they were not young enough to be worried about it. When we asked them, they didn't know much about the peace process, and urban areas, as our colleagues were telling, are really disconnected with some of these processes. So we found empirical effects on this. This is a project we're going to publish now with Mina Chikara, Martin Wallish, Boaz Hamedi, and other of my colleagues and Josh Martin, who have been working on this for a long time. And we have been replicating this in several scenarios. So to end my intervention is basically to tell you that scientific methods can be adapted properly when we get communities to guide our research, to become researchers sometimes, as we have done with a recent project, inviting ex-combatants to be part of the research team. And we started with this idea of transitional research. You can find this in two papers, one led by Samantha Moorberg, and the other one by me and Boaz Hamedi, about how we can use translational research when you get, like scientists, decision makers, and the protagonists to meet and to basically, engage with the local communities, identify the key issues through participatory means, and also through exposing those communities to the data we recollected from the country, so they can tell, they can share with us the thoughts, what they think. Is that correct? Is, how resonates this resonates with the territory, and then translating those findings into policy interventions or policy decisions that can basically focus on changing behaviors and changing specifically call to actions in terms of collective action, and we have been successful at that. Finally, Nadine was asking about a best practice for me. That transitional justice, that transitional research mechanism is very useful, because you share, as I was telling here, you can do perspective taking and sharing. You basically get people to deliberate, and when I say people, when you get participants and protagonists and victims and members of the armed forces and members of, the political parties as your peers, in terms of trying to think critically about the information and think critically about solutions that really can include everyone in terms of the effects we want to do, we can be better at doing psychological interventions. Just to promote this book, this is a book where Nadine is also a co-author in one of the chapters. It's a great book on psychological intergroup interventions, but in my point of view, still is an open invitation to bring in this type of scientific methods to conversations with our colleagues. To end, basically tell you the story about our last project that's called Protective Narratives. We did it in the last part of last year. I had the privilege and honor of my life of meeting all these communities, ex-combatants, peacemakers, local leaders from all ethnicities and all sorts in these terms of in the political real, in the local structures of power. And then we had also the victims, and we had the new communities that are arriving, because as Monika Lara were telling us, there's a lot of displacement going on now, and violence is coming back in a way that we didn't saw 3 decades ago. So this is a small video that I won't show, but it's just to, people that you're seeing here are real ex-combatants who have been doing great stuff using culture, using theater, using public policy. Some of them have run for office, but also you will see other participants confirming what they have been learning from them and the great things they have done together. So this is an example. We're gonna publish the report, but we use for this project, we use narrative analysis, especially deep and very long interviews in all these beautiful places of Colombia. And we saw the variations between why peace is working in some departments and why it's not working in others. And what is like, in a sense, for people, what its explanatory mechanism, it's psychologically speaking, but also in terms of social cohesion, and then on institutional alternatives that people are building now from their own territories. Is most of these people that are building peace in Colombia are now very, very skeptic and also very critical of the total peace project of this government. So for now, this is what I had for you. I hope you can get into our website. We do an annual meeting in Colombia. This time around, I hope we're gonna do a meeting in Colombia, and then we're gonna do another one in Nairobi. We had last time people from Busara, María Cárdenas, especially, she came to Colombia to be part of the third Neuropass that was last year in memory of Emile Bruno. And we get people together to be trained. So we get practitioners, scientists, we have top people from government, but we have people from all realms, media, social leaders, their families, that come together for 3-4 days in different parts of Colombia to share what they know about peace, but also be trained in specific things that they ask for, especially to robust their own projects and make them successful. So that's the story about Neuropass, and I hope I can see you in Colombia or in Nairobi this year.
Thank you so much. I want to come, Andres. Make it possible.
Invited. Everyone's invited now.
Okay, thank you so much for this input. I think everybody understands now why I'm so impressed by you and all of your work. I think you just gave us a glimpse of what you do and all of the projects that you led already. And I think you're like an example of someone who's really trying to connect research with practice and also with organizations on so many levels. And I think all of your 3 talks showed that a peace process needs to include the whole society, and it's not happen. And we see it all over the world in all the conflicts that usually that's not what's happening, and it's underfunded. And usually, like we talk at the elite level, that they are negotiating peace over the society, and that's like a big problem. I'm really super impressed by all of your work, even though I knew you work from before, but now like I know a little bit more. And I want to open the discussion for like at least like 15 more minutes. We're a little bit over time, but I think there are a lot of questions, and I also want to honor you to give more insights that you could share with all of us. So I wonder if someone during this presentation came up with a question to the speakers. You can ask a general question to all 3 of them, but maybe you have a specific question to one of the speakers because they also carry a bit of different expertise and experiences. Is there anyone who wants to ask? Yes, there's a question.
Yes. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. Okay. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much to all 3 of you for demonstrating and giving us a glimpse into your really fascinating scientific research. Thank you, Nadine, for organizing this event. I have a question for Monika, actually, because you said you worked with the clergy, with priests, and with armed actors in your work in Colombia. And I was wondering, first of all, it's a totally novel combination for me to work with. I think especially, as you said, Nadine, here in Germany, the role of the church, or in other countries, the role of the church varies a lot. And so to hear the priests being so involved into this, these mediation processes is really interesting, and also a bit hard for me to imagine how this whole scenario of these very different parties works out. So I was wondering, what were the difficulties or the biggest challenges you encountered in doing this work with these very differing parties in such a complex context?
Thank you for your question. And look, the link between what Andres and Maria and my person have said today, there are two words: the dehumanization and the mind freeze. That's a really big problem here in Colombia, and of course it's inside of the Catholic Church too. And so what my work is to detect with them that there is a mind freeze and that there is dehumanization to other actors. And when they consider it, then they are able to open their mind and to follow the steps working with these actors. Mostly priests, for instance, who are working with armed actors, are like, they like the ideas, or they sympathize with the ideas. They see, for instance, indigenous or Afro-Colombian people as oppressed, as lack of perspectives, and so on. They recognize us, but inside there is the mind freeze. And when we don't get there, then it's difficult to work. But this is my way to work with them.
Thank you, Monika. And you sound like very like hopeful also, that if you like bring people together and you tell them about our biases, then, so it means that because you're actually on the ground and you actually do accompany the negotiation. So I assume that you feel that it's actually like working. So it makes me also hopeful, because you would assume that depending who it is, that it might be not so easy to actually, so you bring people actually together, or you talk with them separately, and then in a different step, people are brought.
First, I spoke to them separately. And when I get something open-minded, then I bring them together.
Okay.
You can't bring them together first because they will clash. So it's really necessary to recognize the bias, to recognize where are mind freeze, and they are very deep-rooted mind freeze, really. And but of all parts, so activists the same, but from their perspective, no?
Yeah.
And really the situation now is that I'm one day full of hope and the other day I don't know what to do, because the state is so weak, and we need the state for building peace, that it's difficult to work with people because they are afraid of the situation. There are no security guarantees, and the guerrilla or the armed actors work with drones and cameras and so on. So they are really afraid to say something, and they don't go to speak to police or military. They say, no, better they are not here. Oh, it's very complicated sometimes, but well, we go on working.
Thank you, Monika. Are there any other questions for the speakers?
Maybe in the meantime, if I can say something, Nadine, I think what Monika just talked about is very important, like to understand how the armed conflict has changed as well. So, and how the armed conflict parties have changed as well. So the diversification of armed actors in the territory make it very, very difficult. And the technology make it very, very difficult for non-violent actors in the territory to confront and deal with that. So, for example, for indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, they have a long history of non-violent resistance to armed actors, and part of that is what I call peace building and peacekeeping milenaria. And it consists, for example, some know the Guardia Indígena, Guardia Cimarrona, and it consists and always consisted in negotiating with the armed actors, talking with them about how to respect the territories, also territorial control, a variety of measures. But the more depoliticized, to say it like that, the armed actors become, and the more diverse and fragmented, the more difficult it gets for also small peasant communities in Colombia, all of these communities, to actually enact territorial control and to maintain themselves separated from the armed violence. And that is a huge challenge right now, because so far for example, indigenous communities would do, they would similar to what Monika did. So someone would come from the same organization but from a different region, just to negotiate with the armed actors to find a solution for kidnappings or for missed ones, and to protect the community that is affected, but also to engage in these negotiations. But this, if you don't have a head, you don't know who to talk to, and the people don't respect any rules anymore, it becomes much more complicated actually to engage in these kind of strategies of preservation, which communities in Colombia have done for such a long time, and their knowledge has not been used for building a peace, and now it has become such a fragmented kind of violence for extractivism, I think. So it's much more difficult to find a solution.
Thank you, Maria. Are there any other questions? Okay, I was wondering how the situation in other countries is impacting the peace process in Colombia. Do you feel like there is an impact when you maybe look at Venezuela and the refugee movement that comes from the country, and maybe you also have insights in how Colombia, the government is dealing with these movements, and also maybe what we can learn for conflict processes in other countries, because migration is a big issue in Europe or in Germany. Do you feel like there are any things we can learn from that, or do you feel like it's a completely different situation and you cannot like draw anything from that situation onto that? So maybe you can, if you have any insight on that. I know it's a little bit different perspective, but I wonder how also issues from other countries spill over and if they have an impact on stability and like development in Colombia.
Maybe I just can share a couple of things. I think that it's definite now that we're more intertwined than ever, and that things that happen, as we are seeing, you know, like the whole debacle that's going on with extreme right parties in the world, is going to affect Colombian elections, especially sadly, because and I don't want to get into, you know, because it's everybody's, you know, we want to focus on what works, but I think like the whole situation in Colombia, and I agree with Maria and Monica, is that we have, and it's the same for the electoral situation in most of the world, and regarding violence, migration, etc. This is our global realities, have been pressured by power and by power struggles, and it's civil society that in the end, at the end, pays with their victimhood, and especially with their instrumentalization in terms of confrontation for electoral means or whatever. So that's my take, and I think Colombia is not free from that. We're not bulletproof to that. And especially now in Colombia, we're facing, even though Colombia is the most open country for migration in Latin America, we have a policy. It's still that, thank God, it's still open, and Colombians have shown high levels of humanization of our Venezuelan. In fact, that it's bigger in terms of, or higher for Venezuelan migrants that when we talk about FARC members. So, you know, there are like nuances and opportunities, but I think the important message for everyone, especially in Europe right now, what we're seeing is that we need to strengthen moral communities in civil society. Political parties are not going to do the work. Emile Bruno used to use this phrase about peace, and, you know, like, politicians make the peace, but our communities are the ones to enforce that peace and to make it happen and sustain it. And I think that's the story that we're telling at the end of the day here, and that demands deliberation, recognition, mutual recognition, and understanding that that society is very complex, and that parts of society still feel that are not being heard. And I think that's where the bad actors in politics prey on these populations. And I think it was that what happened in the United States, and now we are seeing the dismantling of their democracy and their constitutional order. And it's and I think it's a red flag for especially all the countries that still believe in democracy and have to have their own conversations. And have to, you know, in a sense, strengthen their own moral communities. And I think we need new tactics to do that, because I think the old ones are not working and are activating, especially all the biases that make people don't want to be engaged in conversations, basically fall into their own echo chambers and etc. So we need to renew the ways that we talk to each other, especially understanding that sometimes, you know, like we need to be more empathetic and I say more compassive, especially to our, you know, compatriots or connationals that portray hate values and other views of our, because I think we're talking about a research where, for example, religious beliefs can become the shared territory or the shared landscape, and also then having a more dignified conversation between cultures and ethnicities to basically rebuke and destroy these misperceptions around race and around the capacity of migrants to make places better where they go, in order to make that the real conversation and the economic surplus that comes from the presence of immigrants. So I think we and that's why I totally share Monica's cognitive dissonance. One day I'm happy and inspired and I see the news and immediately I, you know, fall into you know, like into skepticism and cynicism. But I think we need, in a sense, to balance this, because I think that science, human creativity, and then arts and technology can help us, you know, what I think we do when we get together. So sorry I took a little bit of time, but I've been thinking heavily on this, especially about the situation in Ukraine, Palestine, etc., and Israel, because with Nadine we have connections with the Israeli Academy, and it has been difficult also to see that reality of a different conflict. So yeah.
Thank you, Andres. Like Maria and Monika, you want to respond also to that?
Do you want to go first, Monika? Okay, so maybe I think Monika perhaps has more figures about the statistics. But I just want to say that I think we need to think about how we phrase the questions as well, because in Germany, migration is not a problem, and it's a discourse. And I think we can turn it into a problem if we believe the discourse. But the problem is not migration in Germany. Germany has benefited from migration over decades. I'm a migrant myself, right? So I think it's important to change the discourse. In Colombia, the same thing happened. Colombia has a history of migration. In Colombia, people left because of the armed conflict over decades, since the 50s. And now that migrants come to Colombia, it's a huge xenophobic act. So I think we need to think about the long history of migration, both to Europe, benefiting from the global north-south divide and benefiting from cheap labor. And at the same time, the same happens again in Colombia as well with Venezuelan migrants, for example. They have become the second-class citizens. So I think we need to say, like Andres said, right? We need to think about the social welfare state. We need to think about how we invest in communities, and in Germany, how we think about social inequality and how this fuels hate and the bashing against minority groups, to say it like that, because I think this is, but because actually in Germany we have a problem of social inequality. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and we make it about migration when it's not about that. So I just wanted to bring this in. I think we need to change the discourse and talk about something else and not about a problem that it's not a problem.
So maybe I have another perspective, which is not linked to migration, but what happens in Venezuela and how it influenced in the peace process in Colombia is not only migration, but the link between the ALN guerrilla and Maduro's government. So here we say you can't get peace in Colombia without Venezuela, because there is a very strong connection between the government of Maduro and ALN. And the escalation of violence last month has to do with Maduro, who won the elections, because ALN, when the situation is bad in Colombia, goes to Venezuela, and Venezuela said, okay, it's our territory, and so Colombian armed forces can't do anything. So, and on the other side, there's Ecuador, with a violence, incredible violence, never seen before. Even before the work of the Truth Commission, where I was present, there were not such a violence as now. And it has to do with the economists, illegal economists of Colombia. So it's not only immigration, but other things who have a strong influence in this.
Thank you so much. And Maria, is it a new hand or was that from before? It's a new hand, right? No? Yeah. Okay.
I can also just skip if someone has a question. So
We also need to look at the time. I mean, you are the speakers, and I don't want to because I know that you wouldn't say no, so that's why I need to do that. So maybe let's check first if someone else has also a question, and then we know how many questions are left. Because if there's one left, then you can add on your thoughts. Does anyone have a question?
I don't really have a question, but I think I'm not really in the topic, or I was not before. Now I'm a bit in the topic. And I think it's really fascinating to have heard your three perspectives, because I think they are very different, but also kind of get together from different angles. And it's very fascinating to kind of dive into a topic with like three perspectives that are so different, but also kind of come together so well and intertwine. So I wanted to say thanks for that. And it really helped me get a better understanding of the situation, even though I still feel like I know.